Welcome back to The Lead. I'm Jake Tapper. Continuing our national lead, the George Zimmerman trial and subsequent not guilty verdict has in many ways presented an opportunity for some soul-searching in this country on matters of race and racial profiling. There are those who believe race was merely injected into this case, while others insist that race is now and always has been at the very heart of this case. The hoodie Trayvon Martin was wearing the night he was killed has become something of a symbol for those who believe that African-American men can be rendered suspicious not by their actions, but by their very presence. New Yorker contributing writer Jelani Cobb wrote that finding Zimmerman not guilty validated, quote, the idea that the actions Zimmerman took that night were those of a reasonable man, that the conclusions he drew were sound, and that a black teenager can be considered armed anytime he is walking down a paved street. So where does the conversation go from here, and how can all sides, attempt to learn something from the other? Joining us now live from New York is writer Jelani Cobb, along with Washington Post columnist Clinton Yates here in studio. Gentlemen, I want to get your reaction to something Zimmerman defense attorney Mark O'Mara said after the verdict when asked how this case would have played out if George Zimmerman were black.
Well, I think that the things would have been different if George Zimmerman was black for this reason. He never would have been charged with a crime.
Jelani, what's your reaction to that? He never would have been charged with a crime if it had been a black-on-black crime.
I don't think that's true at all. And, you know, I don't know what his meaning of that was. I think he seems to have set it up such as we're supposed to believe that Mr. Zimmerman was the victim in all this. There were two people who were there that night. One of them is deceased, and it was not his client. And so, you know, that obviates the idea of him being the victim. But secondly, I think it gets to, you know, a deeper and more problematic conception that African Americans don't care, you know, when this is an issue of someone who dies at the hands of another black person. That's absolutely not true. But I think the real reason that people got out into the streets, the reason that people marched, the people demanded an investigation, was that in an instance like this, where the perpetrator is non-black, there is, you know, a kind of public policy alibi that conspires to make it such that what happened with Mrs. Zimmerman would happen. He'd walk out of the precinct house, he'd walk out of the courthouse as a person who's been acquitted. And I think people understood that.
Well, let's talk about this idea of black-on-black crime, because it's something you've been hearing a lot of. We've been hearing a lot of in the wake of this whole trial. And in fact, conservatives keep bringing up the story of the 16-year-old Darrell Green, a black Chicago teenager killed for not joining a gang. And conservatives say, where is the national focus on Darrell Green? Where are the marches for Darrell Green? Obviously, the homicide rate in Chicago, even if it's lower than it was a year ago, is still tragic. And I can't say that it's an entirely unfair question. We should, the world, the media world, should be focusing on all these deaths. But what do you say to them?
I don't understand why you want to spend so much time wondering why there is an outrage for something else when there is outrage for something when we know the larger problem. I wouldn't spend any more time trying to prove that one death was more worthy of outrage than another. Simply look at the root problem. We have an issue with young black men being targeted and killed by whomever across this country, and it's a real issue. I don't care who's outraged where. It's something we need to address.
So for you, it doesn't matter who pulls the trigger. The point is, no, young black men are dying unnecessarily.
It shouldn't matter who pulls the trigger. I mean, young people, young black men, everybody. We can't have an entire generation of kids growing up knowing and thinking that the murderous ways that occur on a regular basis in America are okay. It's just not.
Jelani, I know this issue bothers you when people bring this up because we talked about it yesterday on CNN. Why? What you think? Do you think this is an attempt to deflect? Do you think this is an attempt to change the subject? What is your issue with when people talk about, well, what about Chicago gang violence?
Well, those two things are not, they're kind of apples and oranges kind of situations. And if people remember, there was a young Miss Hilton who was killed in Chicago, and there was a tremendous amount of outpouring of, you know, grief, you know, demands that her death not be in vain, that people remember, you know, that this is something that's going on in the city and so on. There's organizations like the Interrupters. There are Increase the Peace rallies, but those rallies are not the ones that conservatives talk about. These talked about. When we look at the disproportionate number of African Americans who support strict gun control laws, it is directly related to this idea that they understand black men are somewhere around 20 times more likely to die as a result of homicide than their white counterparts. None of this is taken in a vacuum. The simple fact is that without people getting into the street, there would never have been charges brought against Mr. Zimmerman. That's what this was about. For 44 days last spring, Mr. Zimmerman was able to walk around free after he had taken the life of Trayvon Martin, and it wasn't deemed as even worthy of further investigation. That's what the concern was. Why are there protests and rallies and marches in the case of Trayvon Martin and not in the case of other instances? It was because Trayvon Martin's death would have gone unnoticed by the official police powers had it not been for those protests.
Well, Chief Lee says that they were continuing to investigate it. It's just they didn't think they had a case to build. But right now I want to bring in David Webb. He's host of the David Webb Show on Sirius XM Radio. David, I'm glad that we've been able to get you dialed in. You've said that this case is not about racial profiling, but had Trayvon Martin been a white teenager wearing a hoodie, do you think realistically George Zimmerman would have made the same assumptions he was a criminal?
Well, we don't know what his assumptions were, so we can't draw that distinction. But in the circumstance, I think it's fair to say that had he seen a white person in a hoodie exhibiting the same behavior, based on what we know about him, he would have acted the same way. When it comes to the fact, and we have to stick with the facts on this, Jake, that in Florida, you can charge on bias. And Jelani just talked about the case initially where they didn't raise charges, so there were protests. The fact is we now see in an acquittal, not only on second-degree murder, but any lesser charges put forth in judges' instructions. They had a full acquittal. Therefore, the case was never there to charge him. That's the legal aspect of this. But what we're being drawn into is now that there is unsatisfaction over the verdict by a jury, by both the prosecutors who had to put forth their case and by the defense that did put forth their case successfully, that we now have dissatisfaction and we go back to the hue and cry of it's racism, therefore this becomes the next narrative. And it's the circus beyond the travesty and the circus that surrounded this trial from the incident from 17 months ago till the trial.
Clinton, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't separate race from this case. I think most people believe if he does not see a black teenager, he does not approach
But how do you connect them then? If you can't separate them, how do you connect race?
I think you connect them by saying that the simple reason for the stereotype being
that
there.
There's a point that we should bear in mind, David, and that is that Mrs. Zimmerman made 46 phone calls to the police in the preceding 6 years.
But they don't go
only to African Americans. Only to African Americans. He had called the police on no one else. And prior to this, when he did the initial interview in the precinct house, they asked him why did he pursue against the advice of the police. He said because they always get away. Who gets away? A person who's going home with snacks?
He didn't say blacks always get away. He said they, and the calls don't go to this.
However, the only persons whom he ever deemed suspicious were African Americans.
The calls don't go to the incident. The fact is, when you look at the statistics, and anyone can call the local police department, frankly, anywhere in this country and get the crime statistics. It's not also unreasonable to say that when you have a large amount of incidences, large amount of crimes committed by blacks, that there is going to be, whether you're black, white, Hispanic, or anything, a natural impetus to say, I'm going to be more aware of that dynamic. That said, that doesn't even go to this.
Per race. That's the thing. Not everybody naturally says, because I've seen some people committing some crimes.
But you keep attaching it, but you cannot show a direct attachment to race in this case. You can say it all you want, but you cannot attach it, nor can I detach it as being possible. However, it's what you can prove, and the FBI, they investigated this in 2012. They said there was no civil rights violation. The prosecutors could have done it under Florida law. They did not charge on the basis of bias because there was nothing there that they could show in court.
That doesn't mean it's not true.
Jelani,
well, it's kind of like, when did you stop beating your wife? That kind of throws out a negative, and now you have to defend it.
No, that's actually not the case, David, because if you recall, there was witness 9 who was a blood relative of Mrs. Zimmerman, who said that he held quite prominently racist ideas as it related to African Americans. That testimony was not allowed in. That person was not allowed into the testimony.
Well, then if it's not allowed in, it might not be found credible. But then they didn't allow the toxicology of Trayvon, sad as it is that he's dead. They disallow things in trials if they find them not relevant or not credible.
Again, that's not true. The minuscule amount of marijuana that was in Mr. Martin's bloodstream was brought up in the case. What we did not find out, because he was never tested, was what was in George Zimmerman's bloodstream. Beyond this, you know, this has become a kind of instance of blame the victim here. There are two people who were there one night. Let me finish this. Let me finish, David. There were two people there that one of those people had a criminal record, one of them did not. The person who had the criminal record with 2 instances of violence, once for domestic violence and once for assault on a police officer, is the person who did the shooting. Yet our concern has predominantly been with the person who was shot.
Jelani, let me ask you a fair question. I think it's a fair question we should all ask ourselves. If you're going to use everything about Zimmerman's background, then is everything about Trayvon's background also valid?
Well, if everything, particularly relating to someone who has instances of violence,
is it valid
arrest,
to say that you should have one or both fully in play?
We're talking about the incident. No, because one person has been shot.
Then you're not being honest.
I'm afraid. Jelani and David. Jelani and David. It's a great conversation. We've left because it's so good. Unfortunately, we have to take a break. To be continued. We are going to keep talking about this, and we will have all of you back to talk about it. Jelani Cobb, David Webb, Clinton Yates. Thank you so much for your views, for your passion, for coming here today. Appreciate it. Stay with CNN for continuing coverage of the George Zimmerman verdict. Tonight, Piers Morgan will have an exclusive interview with the star witness for the prosecution, Rachel Gintel. She's the young woman who was on the phone with Trayvon Martin just before his confrontation with George Zimmerman began. We'll also have reaction from George Zimmerman's brother, Robert Zimmerman Jr. That's tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern, only on CNN. Coming up, he's got secrets that he says could hurt the U.S. government. Can Edward Snowden be trusted to keep them secret? I'll ask Glenn Greenwald, who spoke to the NSA leaker as recently as a few hours ago.